I'm the administrator of the local agency system support office here at the California Department of Education. And today we are here to go over the engaging educational partners requirements within the local control and accountability plan for 2025-26. As part of this is, again, the resources can be found down in the resources tab. There's a link to the PowerPoint, or you can directly download the file in the documents. And this is one of our ongoing series of webinars related to the 2025-26 LCAP. This coming Thursday, we will have the goal analysis, and then we'll be continuing through the next 2 weeks in December, going through additional portions and finishing up in early January. The template files are available on the Local Control and Accountability Plan webpage. They're also linked in the slides themselves. So if you download the slides, you'll have access to those files. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss why engagement of educational partners is critical in the development of the LCAP. We're going to talk about the requirements for engaging educational partners in the development of the LCAP. We're going to talk about the requirements for completing the educational partner engagement section of the LCAP. And then we're going to go through just some suggestions and resources that are available for you all to use as you work with your educational partners on the LCAP. The intended audience for today is pretty much anybody that's working with engaging educational partners in the development of the LCAP. That could include board members, that could include advisory committee members, that could include members of the community, as well as staff. So let's go ahead and get into why educational partner engagement is essential. One of the things that we've touched on before is that engaging educational partners engaging educational partners meaningfully in comprehensive planning is necessary in order to support improved student outcomes. And if we think back to the foundational principles of the local control funding formula, LCFF, one of the three key foundational principles of that is subsidiarity, which is the idea that social and political issues are best dealt with at the local level. In order for subsidiarity to work, there has to be meaningful engagement of educational partners, and this is part of what's envisioned through the LCAP process. If you look at the LCAP template instructions, the very first page, there's a note that the LCAP development process serves three distinct and related functions: comprehensive strategic planning, meaningful engagement of educational partners, and accountability and compliance. And when we're talking about the meaningful engagement of educational partners, we're really talking about how is it that we are able to build trust within the community with those that we're working with, whether that's at the site level, whether that's with educators, with parents, with community members, with students. How is it that we're working to build that? Meaningful engagement of educational partners acknowledges that our local partners have their own unique view on things. They have important perspectives about student needs and how to address those needs. And the significant and purposeful engagement of these educational partners is really going to ensure that the LCAP development process is going to result in a plan that reflects those local needs and the decisions that have been made in order to address those needs. It's not a one-time thing. It's an annual ongoing process. It's something that continues throughout the school year. The benefits of engaging the educational partners is that there's also a better understanding of current needs and possible solutions. There's more informed decision making. Again, there's greater trust. There's stronger and longer lasting partnerships, and there's a greater likelihood of improved student outcomes. And so all of these things together uh, are benefits of this educational partner engagement process, and things that we want to see come out of it. So having touched on that, let's go ahead and get into who needs to be consulted as part of the development of the LCAP. Statute is pretty clear in laying out some specific educational partners that have to be engaged with in the development of the LCAP. And there's standards for county offices and districts, and then there's additional standards for charter schools. For our county offices and districts, prior to adopting the LCAP, the LEA has to engage with teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, local bargaining units, parents, and students. And when we're talking about parents in this context, the regulations for the LCAP identify that parents are those educational rights holders. And so educational rights holders, in addition to the other groups that are listed here, have to be consulted in the development of the LCAP. That's so hopefully it's apparent that takes place prior to the plan being adopted. Since we're going into year 2 of the 3-year cycle, probably most of this engagement that's going to take place is going to be related to kind of looking at the data, and identifying if there's anything that needs to be tweaked or adjusted. It's not going to be quite as in-depth as when the first year of the 3-year plan is being developed. But that engagement still needs to take place. For charter schools have to consult with teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, parents, again, meaning the educational rights holders of students, and the students themselves in the development of the plan. And so those are the required groups that have to be consulted with in the development of the LCAP. When we're talking about this required consultation, if the LEA has a school, one or more schools that are receiving equity multiplier funding, there's also a requirement that that educational partners from those schools be involved in the development of the LCAP, and specifically around the development of the equity multiplier goal or goals that are applicable to those schools. So that educational partner input also needs to be part of the engagement session that goes on for LEAs that have equity multiplier funding. Now, these statutory requirements in terms of consultation that we just went over identify kind of what the floor is in terms of engagement. That's what everybody must do. Obviously, you can go beyond that if you want. You can go beyond just specifically those groups that are participating. You can also, in terms of how many times you want to engage with those groups, that's really up to you. Statute doesn't really identify the any specific number of times to engage. Statute doesn't identify any particular avenues for engagement. It simply says that there has to be engagement of those groups in the development of the plan. And so there's really no specificity in terms of how many times they have to be engaged or anything like that. That's up to the LEA. Obviously, if you're doing a good job of reaching out, that communication, that engagement is going to be ongoing. Especially if we're talking about things that are going on at school sites, that's going to be something that is going to occur, on a more ongoing basis than just a one time. Additional partner considerations, folks that you might consider including, families, school site councils, parent advisory committee, English learner parent advisory committee, SELPA administrators, community advisory committee for the SELPAs, English learner coordinators, foster youth, homeless coordinators, federal program administrators. If you have like a Black Parallel School Board or some other sort of parent group that you want involved in that, again, this is an opportunity for them to be involved in that co-construction of the plan. And so those are just groups to keep in mind. But again, you have to engage at a minimum with those statutorily required groups. So we've talked about who has to be consulted as part of the development of the plan. Let's talk about what additional requirements LEAs have to fulfill before adopting the LCAP. And this is not part of the consultation process so much as it is providing folks with an opportunity to review and provide input on what is proposed within the plan. So in the consultation phase, when educational partners are being consulted with, it's when the plan is still being constructed. What we're going to be talking about now is after the plan has been put together, but before the plan has been adopted, what avenues are there for folks to provide feedback on the plan prior to it being adopted? So specifically for county offices and districts, once the LCAP has been developed, county offices and districts have to present the developed LCAP to the following advisory committees as applicable: the Parent Advisory Committee, the English Learner Parent Advisory Committee, if there's a numerically significant number of English learners in the LEA, and then a Student Advisory Committee if there aren't students serving on the Parent Advisory Committee. And we'll talk a bit about that in just a moment. Now, when we're talking about this particular requirement, when it's talking about present the developed LCAP, that means that it has to be the full LCAP. It can't be bits and pieces of the LCAP. It's not just the goals and actions. It's the entire draft of the LCAP that has to come to the Parent Advisory Committee and the English Learner Parent Advisory Committee for them to review. And the superintendent of the LEA is required to respond in writing to those two advisory committees, to the Parent Advisory Committee and the English Learner Parent Advisory Committee, for any of the comments or questions that they present. The superintendent does not have to respond in writing to the Student Advisory Committee. That's not required by statute. And so that's something that needs to be made really clear to folks. The other thing that needs to be really clear is who the members of the committee are. The statute requires that the school board be the one to actually develop these committees. So the committees and the members on the committees, whether that's the Parent Advisory Committee, the English Learner Parent Advisory Committee, or the Student Advisory Committee, need to be specified, identified by the school board to the members of the public, so that everybody's aware of who the members of these various committees are. And part of that, as we'll touch on in a little bit, is because all of these three committees are subject to elements of the Green Open Meeting Act, as well as Public Records Act requests. So it needs to be open and available to the public. And so all of these groups are, need to be identified by the governing board. So again, going back to students on advisory committees, the Parent Advisory Committee in Education Code Section 52063 identifies that the Parent Advisory Committee has to include, Parent Advisory Committee of an LEA that is serving middle school and high school students has to include at least 2 students on the Parent Advisory Committee, unless they have a separate Student Advisory Committee. If there's no Student Advisory Committee, then they have to have 2 students serving on the Parent Advisory Committee. If the governing board of the district or the county office establishes a Student Advisory Committee, then they're required to take into consideration the diversity of the school district and the county office students. And they're also asked to pay particular to ensure that the at-risk and disadvantaged students are serving as members of that community. Again, that's part of Education Code Section 52063. In terms of the Green Act requirements that we touched on in a moment ago, the Student Advisory Committee, the Parent Advisory Committee, the English Learner Parent Advisory Committee are all required to follow the Green Act that's specified in Education Code Section 35147. This includes the meetings have to be open to the public. The members of the public have to be provided with the opportunity to address the committee at the meeting. The meetings have to be publicly noticed 72 hours in advance, which includes the meeting date, the time, location of the meeting, and the agenda of what will be discussed. All of those things need to be open and available to the public when these advisory groups are going on. And so all of that needs to be in there. In terms of identified, when we're talking about the requirement for the governing board to identify or to develop these particular committees, how the governing board does that is really up to them. They can defer that to the school district for the school district to choose, and then it be reported to the governing board of who's going to be on that committee. It can be done in various ways. There's really no composition requirements for the Parent Advisory Committee and the English Learner Parent Advisory Committee, other than there be a majority of parents serving on those committees. There also have to be parents that represent the unduplicated student groups, low-income English learner foster youth students. So what that looks like, it's really up to the LEA. It's really up to the governing board to make that determination. There's the requirement in 52063 is that if there's already existing committees that are in place, the LEA can use those existing committees that are in place but they're not required to. Also, there's no requirement that any committee members be elected or anything else like that. It's really, again, at the discretion of the LEA in terms of what that looks like and how that takes place. So let's continue talking about additional COE and district requirements. County offices and school districts are required to present a report on the annual update to the LCAP, on the LCAP and the budget overview for parents on or before February 28th of this year, of each year. So February 28th of 25. That report is required to include all available mid-year outcome data related to metrics identified in the current year's LCAP and all available mid-year expenditure and implementation data for the actions that are identified in the current year's LCAP. County offices and districts are also required to hold at least one public hearing to solicit recommendations and comments from members of the public regarding specific actions and expenditures that are proposed to be included within the LCAP. All of those are opportunities for the members of the public to provide thoughts, input, etc. And also ways that the LCAP can be made more visible within the community and what that looks like. When we're talking about charter schools, in addition to engaging educational partners as part of the development of the LCAP, charter schools are required to present a report on the annual update and the budget overview for parents on or before February 28th. Again, that has to include the available mid-year outcome data related to the metrics in the current year LCAP, as well as the available mid-year expenditure and implementation data on actions identified in the current year's LCAP. They're also required to hold a public hearing to solicit recommendations. However, the public hearing for the charter school can be part of the same meeting of the governing body at which the LCAP is adopted. For county offices and districts, it has to be a separate meeting. For charter schools, it has to be the same meeting. And so that's something that needs to occur. Also, if there's a charter school that is using the LCAP as their school plan for student achievement, their SIPSA, for federal planning purposes, then they have to ensure that they are meeting the requirements that we went over for county offices and school districts. So charter schools that are using the LCAP as the SIPSA have to have a parent advisory committee, English learner parent advisory committee, if it's applicable. They have to have students on the parent advisory committee or a student advisory committee. And they have to ensure that the LCAP is presented to those committees. If the charter school isn't using the LCAP as the SIPSA, then they're not required to do any of that. And so there's that as well to be aware of. So having talked about additional requirements, let's get into LCAP adoption, submission, approval, and posting requirements. So for county offices and districts, the governing board of the LEA has to adopt the LCAP at a public meeting on or before July 1st of each year. This does not have to be a regularly scheduled meeting. It simply has to be noticed 72 hours in advance. However, that meeting does need to take place before July 1st. The meeting needs to be held after, but not on the same day as the public hearing that we discussed previously. The meeting is the same meeting at which the governing board adopts the budget. It's also the same meeting at which the LEA is going to report its local indicators to the governing board. Those local indicators that are provided on the California School Dashboard. So those things have to take place related to the adoption of the LCAP. For charter schools, again, the LCAP has to be adopted on or before July 1st of each year. And similar to districts and county offices, the governing body of the charter school has to report its local indicators at the meeting. They also are going to update the goals and actions to achieve the goals that have been reported out. Not later than 5 days after the adoption of the LCAP, school districts and um, county offices of education are required to submit their LCAPs to their reviewers. So county offices are submitting their LCAP to the CDE. School districts are submitting their LCAPs to the County Office of Education. Charter schools have to submit the LCAP to the chartering authority and the county superintendent of schools. Or if the county superintendent of schools is the chartering authority, they just submit it to the county. And that's part of the regular charter oversight procedure. In terms of posting requirements, once the LCAP has gone through its review and approval process for school districts and county offices, school districts are going to post the approved LCAP, that which has been approved by the County Office of Education, on the homepage of the district website. And when it says any approved LCAP, that's all of the LCAPs that have been adopted historically by the school district. So we're talking about going back to 2014 when the LCAP first came out. All of the LCAPs from 2014 onward need to be posted on the school district's webpage. They also have to post LCAPs that are submitted by charter schools that were authorized by the district or links to those plans on the homepage. In addition to this, just as a reminder, the other thing that needs to be posted on the webpage is addendums to the LCAP. So specifically the LCAP federal addendum needs to be posted to this page as well. And when we're talking about the homepage, statute states that the link to the LCAP needs to be posted prominently on the homepage of the district's website. A lot of times, if you go on to a district's website, you look at their homepage, there's nothing about the LCAP on the webpage at all. If there's nothing about the LCAP on the homepage, if there's no link to another page that has all of the LCAPs on there, then that LEA could potentially have a UCP filed against it because those LCAPs are not posted or link to the LCAP page is not posted on the homepage of the website. So, that's something to take note of. County offices similarly have to post any approved LCAP for the county office LCAP on its webpage. They also have to post the LCAPs that are submitted by school districts, charter schools, or links to those plans on the county office webpage. And then for charter schools have to post any LCAP that has been adopted by the governing body of the charter school. And again, any updates or addenda. So again, the LCAP federal addendum. And so that's something that needs to occur for charter schools. Also, just a reminder for any LEA out there, the Education Code section 48985 requires that any written notifications related to the LCAP that go home to parents be translated. And again, that's for 15% or more. That needs to be adhered to. Also, at this point in time, everybody should be aware that the approved LCAP is required to be posted to the California School Dashboard. We had a great response this first year. The 2024 dashboard was the first time that requirement was in place. We had almost every LEA in the state upload their LCAP to the dashboard. And so those are now available on the dashboard. It creates a really clear connection between what shows up on the dashboard and the LCAP. And it makes it really easy to refer everybody, folks, to those plans. So thank you to all of you out there for all of your work in getting the LCAPs uploaded to the dashboard. It's really been a great addition. Currently, the uploading window has closed, and so that'll be reopened for the 2025 dashboard in mid-October of next year. But there's nothing to worry about or think through related to the LCAP posting at this point in time. But again, thank you to all of you for your work in getting that posted. So let's transition from talking about the requirements that have to be done as part of developing and getting the plan adopted, and start talking about the section within the LCAP itself. The Engaging Educational Partners section it consists of two components. We've got the summary of the process used to engage educational partners in the development of the plan, and we've got the description of how the adopted LCAP was influenced by the feedback that was provided by educational partners. The very first prompt is the table. It looks like this. Everybody, filled it out last year. In that, it's a summary of the process. For again, on this slide, there's reminders of who has to be consulted with. But the table is flexible. You can add in additional groups if you want. So if you've included additional groups in your consultation process, you can include them within here. All you need to do is identify the educational partners and then describe the process that you used for engaging them. You can also group. So the various, if you've got a process that corresponds to numerous educational partners, you can group those all together and have one single discussion related to those things that apply to all of the educational partners. The instructions for this piece are pretty straightforward. In the educational partners column, you identify the applicable educational partners that were engaged in the development. And in the process for engagement, you describe the engagement process that's used by the LEA to involve the identified educational partners in the development of the LCAP. One of the things that the instructions go into a bit more in detail is what it means to what constitutes a sufficient response related to this prompt. And so we want to call that out. A sufficient response is going to provide general information about the timeline and process of the meetings. Again, that doesn't have to be down to the day. You can list dates and times of meetings if you want, but at a minimum, there have to be some sort of timeline that's involved there. So particular months that groups met or things like that. The response also needs to include information about how those meetings and strategies with educational partners took place and kind of the things that were discussed. And then again, just remember that if you have equity multiplier schools, that those educational partners are part of this process as well. Specifically, when you're talking about identifying how those educational partners were engaged, it's really critical that you call out that the educational partners for equity multiplier sites were involved in particular stages of the engagement process, so that it's clear to folks how those are showing up. One of the things that we saw in LCAPs this time around is folks having to go back and add in additional information or make it clear how those educational partners from equity multiplier sites were involved in the engagement process. And so that is something that folks need to keep in mind. When we get into the second prompt, the description of how the adopted LCAP was influenced by the feedback of educational partners. When we look at the instructions for completing this, the instructions ask that there be a description of any goals, metrics, actions, budgeted expenditures in the LCAP that were influenced by or developed in response to the feedback. And so here it's not just like some general statement saying that the LCAP reflects feedback from these people. It's saying this particular goal or these particular actions or these particular metrics were included based on this feedback. So that it's pointing to specific things within the LCAP that are reflective of educational partner feedback. When we're talking about, again, this piece about the sufficient response, the sufficient response is going to make it clear to educational partners how their input influenced the LCAP, what showed up as part of that process, and where that can be found, so that it's going to be clear to folks when they're looking at the plan, they can see that feedback that's showing up. For purposes of this prompt, the instructions also identify some various things that could be included. They're not required to be included, but if we're talking about the inclusion of a particular focus goal that was added in, or particular metrics that were related to things that were included, actions that are specific to a particular student group or something along those lines. Those are all things that can be included as part of that description. Another thing that can be included is if something was removed from the plan. So that's especially pertinent as we're looking at year 2. If there's feedback that we get from educational partners that's specifically related to things that might not need to be included within the plan, then we could note that those things have been taken out as part of the engaging educational partners process. And these are some additional things that could be included, such as analysis of effectiveness of specific actions, and analysis of challenges and successes of those particular actions. All of those things would kind of be reflective of that educational partner feedback. So having mentioned that, let's get, I want to get into some reminders here. When we're talking about the LCAP, a lot of times the LCAP can tend to be a very dense kind of technical document. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Part of the dynamic that exists within the LCAP, that creative tension that exists within the LCAP, is who to write the LCAP for. Is the LCAP being written for your reviewer? Is it being written for the County Office of Education? Is it being written for your constituents, the families that you serve? Is it being written to ensure that folks know that you're meeting legal requirements? Who's the primary audience of that? Ideally, it's going to balance, what's required in terms of review and approval with producing a document that's clear for folks to understand at a practical level. The LCAP's not supposed to be like, it's really not intended to be the technical guide for how to accomplish all of the actions and services. But the actions and services should be able to be understood by those that are reading the plan. And so especially when we're talking about parents or students, in the case of secondary programs, where they're actually spending time looking at the LCAP, ensuring that the language that we're using and the level of detail that we're using is understandable for those folks that are reading the plan is going to be important. It's going to be necessary for them to ensure that for the LEAs to ensure that they can read that. So keep that in mind as you're looking at the LCAP, as you're working through any revisions that you make to the plan moving forward. So I want to talk through some considerations, and these are more practical things that could be done in order to promote meaningful engagement. And we'll go through a number of different areas of what these look like. We'll start off with planning. When we're talking about planning, are we looking at inclusiveness, accessibility, and equity? Are we focusing on those particular things? Are we focusing on strong relationships? Building out those respectful, collaborative, and trusting relationships with folks, or are we just kind of checking a box? Are we ensuring that we're building and maintaining those trusting relationships in order to build a sense of shared responsibility within the community about the education of students? It's not just the job of the teacher in the classroom, it's also the job of parents, of families, of the students themselves. How are we making sure that that's being communicated? And then meaningful engagement in the LCAP development process, where it's not just throwing out a survey at folks and saying Do you agree or disagree? It's maybe meeting with some folks and asking more open-ended questions, giving them the opportunity to kind of weigh in. In addition, having a sense of shared responsibility, both within the plan and within the education of students, focusing on those improved student outcomes, having transparency with folks in terms of what's going on, and then that shared focus on continuous improvement. That having transparency is something that goes a long way towards building trust and relationships. It's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, for everybody's needs to be met within the particular community. And so being able to identify, here's what it is that we're doing to address the needs, here's why these needs have been prioritized, and sharing that transparently, sharing that openly, is something that can go a long way towards building trust within the community. It's not something that is going to be built if we're not having open lines of communication. In terms of strategies related to continuous improvement, are we monitoring the impact of our engagement strategies? Are we looking and asking for feedback related to how to improve our engagement efforts and outcomes? Are we reflecting upon prior practices and approaches that we've had, and then using that in order to change processes and help folks be able to become more authentically engaged within the process? You know, Understanding the needs and interests of educational partner groups is important. A lot of times, we might do our best to get folks engaged, get folks involved, provide them with opportunities for engagement and ways to provide that feedback. The oftentimes, we can get disappointed if the results that we don't get back are less than what we'd hoped for. But the important thing is to continue to try to reach out and to continue to try to engage. Whether or not folks do engage is a different matter. Also, how they engage. If you're in a rural LEA or you're in a small LEA, your engagement process might look different than a larger LEA. That's okay. There's not a problem with that, but we want to ensure that we're looking at what's being effective. If we're not getting out of our engagement strategies what we want to see out of them, how can we revise them and ensure that those processes are improving? How can we make sure that folks are informed of what's going on? In terms of systems and structures, are we dedicating resources and staff support to support the engagement of educational partners? Is it something that's the job of one person? Or is it something that's the job of multiple people? Are we ensuring that this is something that's kind of encapsulated within our LEA as a whole, so that everybody from administrators to the office staff to the teachers themselves are helping to support this engagement of educational partners and being able to talk get input from students and parents, and synthesize all of that together. Are we providing dedicated time for collaboration? Are we developing policies and practices that embed that educational partner engagement um, into the culture of the LEA and into engagement events? And are we establishing partnerships with community-based organizations in order to support ongoing student learning and development? Those are all things that take more time, more effort, but can also pay more dividends down the line. It certainly helps to the community to be more on board with the education and with what's going on within the various school sites. In terms of strategies related to conditions and climate, are we building trusting relationships, shared responsibility, collaboration? Those are ongoing themes. Are we seeking to understand the languages and cultures of student groups to the extent that we can? Are we communicating early and often using multiple formats and strategies? Are we maintaining and creating welcoming environments to ensure that educational partners feel valued? Are we reflecting on the process of engaging educational partners in the LCAP and what that looks like, as well as providing multiple opportunities for consultation? And then are we supporting staff, helping to support staff in building their capacity related to engagement and consultation? Are we implementing strategies that build that staff capacity as part of what it is that we're doing on an ongoing basis, and providing training to administrators and staff related to facilitating engagement? What sorts of things are we doing there in order to improve capacity? And then strategies in terms of participation and representation. What are we doing to ensure that underrepresented educational partner groups are heard from? Some LEAs might not have a lot of underrepresented educational partners. Some LEAs might have a lot of them. What are you doing to identify, here's an underrepresented educational partner group? How do we know when we're hearing from those groups or not hearing from those groups? What are we doing to reach out to them? Are we calling them? Are we doing home visits with them? Are we identifying potential barriers to engagement and how those might be resolved? And then monitoring the impact of strategies to address those barriers, not just what have we done to address them, but is what we're doing to address them actually bearing fruit? Are we seeing more of those, more folks engaging because of these activities? And then ensuring that our communication strategies using multiple methods in order to reach out to folks and get their input. Not just the robocalls and the emails that go out to folks, but also meetings at local school sites, on an in-person basis, or potentially home visits or phone calls, things like that. And then in terms of meaningful engagement, providing educational partners with information regarding the meetings that are occurring related to the plan, and ensuring that those are being done in a clear, timely, and understandable manner, allowing time for information to be reviewed, translated, made accessible, etc. Are we providing accommodations and supports to ensure that engagement opportunities are accessible? Whether that's providing meals, providing childcare, providing interpretation, etc. How are we ensuring that those things are going on? Are we implementing practices that solicit information from all educational partners? And are we fostering practices that promote active analysis of data, identification of needs, and suggestions for addressing those needs? So in the last couple of minutes, just as a closing thought, remember that the foundational principle of subsidiarity doesn't work unless there are trusting relationships. You've heard, numerous times this afternoon about those trusting relationships. They have to be developed and maintained with respect, honesty, openness, and responsiveness. And building and maintaining those trusting relationships is something that's a responsibility both of the educational partners and the LEA. It's not just about the teacher, it's not just about the parent, it's about both groups of people coming together and being able to communicate with each other. And the more that those trusted relationships are built, the more that we can have open and honest conversations about what sorts of things need to change, about how those things can change, and about the positive impacts that are being made for and in students. In addition, we'd just like to encourage folks to really focus on ensuring that the LCAP is well written. And what that means, it depends really on the community. What a well-written LCAP looks like is going to be different, based on the community that you serve. But if you focus on how are we supporting comprehensive planning? How are we supporting meaningful engagement? And how is accountability and compliance being supported? And keeping those things in mind when the LCAP is being written, it's going to help that LCAP be a document that folks can easily understand and digest and be able to focus in on. Here at the end of the deck, we've provided you with some resources. The CCEE on the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence on its LCAP webpage has some resources around creating authentic community engagement, as well as the Community Engagement Initiative. We encourage you to check those out. We've also included links to the LCAP resources webpage, which has additional development considerations and resources for you, as well as links to the various pieces of education code that we've discussed and that identify a lot of the requirements that we've talked about throughout this presentation. If you have any questions for us related to this presentation, anything else relating to the LCAP or the local control funding formula, you can feel free to email us at lcff@cde.ca.gov. If you need additional information about this webinar or upcoming webinars, you can find that on our Tuesday at 2 webpage. And if you aren't already subscribed to the LCFF listserv, please do so by sending a blank email message to join LCFF list at mlist.cde.ca.gov. And with that, we say thank you for being here with us today. We appreciate your time. For those of you that still have questions that we haven't been able to get to and answer, please feel free to email us, and we'll be more than happy to get back to you with those. Again, we thank you for taking time out of your day to be here with us, and we wish you all a good afternoon. Hope to see you on Thursday for goal analysis. Thanks, and have a good afternoon.